All right, Chris Peaks back with my good friend Chris here for another one of our Civil War chats. I enjoy these. One of my favorite people to talk to about the Civil War, and one of the reasons is he's fair to both sides. Um, we see so many pro Unionists or pro Confederates just condemn the other side to hell, and there's awful commanders overrated, but he looks at stuff subjectively, and I think gives everybody a fair shake, and I've always appreciated his assessment in these. Not many people are able to do that, so I'm going to ask him an interesting question tonight. So I've been looking at different generals, campaigns, and stuff throughout American history. Is it fair to say that Robert E. Lee was the greatest tactical commander to ever come out of West Point?
Um, I don't know if I can make that assessment, to be honest. It's kind of disappointing after the intro you just gave me. I mean, like, how would you compare to someone like Patton? I mean, Patton was an extraordinary tactical commander, as far as I know, but I'm not an expert on Patton. I've heard that Eisenhower wasn't bad either. I don't know if I could comment on a West Point. I mean, it gets tricky. He was good at it, you know.
Yeah, I guess
Um,
saying greatest. Those are kind of some kind of you know tough labels. Put greatest and worst. So but did he have a gift that because even in the battles that Lee lost, um, inconclusive because a lot of them was inconclusive. Tactically, fundamentally, he made the right decisions. Of course, all of them didn't go to plan. We can go over like the 7 days. Um,
yeah,
you know,
no, I would say you can say that of a lot of generals, right? Like, if everything had gone to plan at the Battle of the Crater, the Civil War in Virginia would have probably ended in June of 1864.
good point.
Um, everything had gone to plan at Champions Hill, there might have been no need for a siege of Vicksburg. So I mean, I think the but for argument I think could be used to vilify or glorify anyone. And Antietam, I think what Lee is defined by is his audaciousness. I think the doctrinal term is audacity and the will to violence, but I don't know because I have no formal training in this. I'm just just a tubby speculator. But the if you take Antietam for example, which I think was the battle you were alluding to, um, on the defensive, it is an extraordinary defense. It's an incredible touch and go defense where every aspect of Lee's army seems to be working in perfect coordination. It also helps that McClellan only attacked with half of his force at any given time. He had never more than 46,000 men attacking Lee's army. And there's also the reality that the next day, Lee wanted to attack McClellan, which I think is insane. And so did all of his generals. Even Jackson privately expressed extreme reservation for making an attack on the 18th.
Really, Lee wanted to attack.
He did. And he asked his I can't remember exactly who he asked to report on it, but he wanted to scout out the feasibility of launching an offensive against McClellan. And I think it's hard to fit into the narrative of the brilliant Lee, because if I said that about, say, Grant wanting to attack an army of, at that point 75,000 with a scratch force of 30,000, there'd be folks who would say, well, there's Grant being a butcher again.
Yeah,
So it gets kind of tricky. Um, Lee was incredibly audacious
I
as
mean,
a tactical thinker, and that it
when we
produces
start,
it also produces Malvern Hills.
um, when we start with the 7 day, like at Golding's Farm, and those battles. Jackson was late. Um, D.H. Hill pressed the attack when Jackson was supposed to attack first.
Yeah.
A lot of miscommunication with his commanders. Was the tactical decisions still correct, but just the battlefield just we didn't have radios in that day. It changed on the fly.
Well, I mean, I'm no expert on Malvern Hill. I think part of it is if you look at the command structure in the Civil War, it tends to it tends to become wider and wider very quickly. So, okay, it's important to note that when we talk about trained at West Point. West Point really didn't prepare any of these guys for this kind of a conflict, right? West Point was a glorified engineer school.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, basically it was an engineering art school where occasionally you might learn a little bit of tactics. But the tactics in the West Point curriculum really weren't. It really wasn't ubiquitous in the in the curriculum, and where it was present, it tended to only rise to the brigade level, which, if you think about it, makes sense because we have to remember that when West Point was established, America had only fought one major foreign war. That was the War of 1812, and it was War of 1812 veterans who established West Point. And the War of 1812 really was never fought above the brigade level. In the War of 1812, the U.S. Army might be 2 brigades, right, which would hardly even make for a division in the Civil War. And we look at the beginning of the Civil War, brigade level tactics is what we're doing, right? At the Battle of Bull Run, it's, if memory serves, basically 8 brigades on each side. That's it. There's no division commanders. There's, on the Confederate side, 2 army commanders, since technically it was the Army of the Shenandoah and the Army of the Potomac on the Confederate side. And for the Federals, it's Irwin McDowell commanding the Army of Northeastern Virginia. But in both cases, no divisional commanders, just brigade. When we get to the 7 Days Campaign, we start seeing division, right? So the newly christened Army of Northern Virginia now has 5 divisions under its command. McClellan is beginning to use the corps system since the Lincoln administration imposed on him. He didn't want to use it. But basically what I'm getting at is I don't think at first any of these officers really know how to wield forces of this size. They have to experiment. So part of Lee's problem is he's suddenly assuming command of what would be at that time one of the largest armies in the history of the United States. And an organizational system that he doesn't really know anything about. So arguably Lee's plans in the 7 days are overly complicated. It's also difficult because the Confederate Congress would not authorize corps organization until October, I think, of 1862. So they're not even in corps yet. They're in divisions, so it's very awkward. And I think also part of it was the irascibility of his commanders. D.H. Hill was not phenomenal when it came to listening to others. He was a pretty decent general, but he was extremely cantankerous and argumentative. Hence his flippant defiance.
Hill had some bad moments during the 7 days as well.
And Jackson, I mean, in fairness to Jackson, the man was exhausted.
They'd marched 30 hours.
Sorry?
They'd marched like 30 hours.
Yeah, they and remember, they had literally just fought the 7 Days Campaign. Like, there's no rest for them. When you get to, I think it's the Battle of, I always mix them up, but the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, I think, before the or Mechanicsville, they're very close by each other. Jackson is supposed to flank, and he's woken up from his sleep to be reminded of this, and he basically says, if they need us, they'll call for us. That's not something Jackson would normally do. It shows you how utterly exhausted he was, and his men no different. So Lee arguably made the mistake of, this sounds like the old trope, but actually asking too much. And he was. So, you know, part of it's communication, part of it's having a new command structure, part of it is the organizational problems of a divisional system without an artillery reserve. One of the problems in the NB at this time is it had no centralized artillery reserve after the battle.
Was he on a level, and I'm not trying to glorify him at all in this, you know, because Lee seemed to have a sense that, you know, he knew where the key points, objective points was on the field. Was his plan so intricate that it was almost impossible to follow because they all based on timing? And if you was off by a minute, your whole plan could go out the window?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it was a lot to ask. Like, I'm getting something battles here, but at Glendale, he's trying to attack the Federals from both angles and the center, right? Like it's, and at Mulvern Hill, it's I'm trying to remember, but I think it was like a 2-pronged flanking attack and then a drive to center. Like, if I remember, and I might be getting this totally wrong. If anyone's watching this, I'm getting it wrong, I apologize. My 7 days isn't my best.
Yeah, I mess them up too. So
but my understanding of it is, broadly speaking, yeah, they're too complex. And again, it's you can look at that, and this is kind of where bias comes in. How do you interpret that? Do you say, well, that's just, oh, he was just too brilliant and didn't have the tools to accomplish his goal? Or do we conclude that he failed to adequately assess the resources he had available, and made the mistake of overcomplicating his offensive, and making unreasonable expectations, right? So this is what I mean by how we interpret, right? Like, we tend to look at Lee as the great tactician and Grant as the butcher. It's really interesting to flip it on its head and assess Lee with the criteria used for Grant, and to assess criteria for Lee. And if we do, I think we get a very different outcome. Lee is a butcher who takes unnecessary, audacious risks and suffers the highest percentage of losses of any general in the war. And Grant is able to win successive battles and even overcome enemies that are heavily entrenched. But if we go with the conventional kind of pigeonholed criteria, where Lee is the great tactician, Grant is the great strategian, then we assume Grant's a bit of a tactical lughead, and Lee perhaps at his best in maneuver. But again, you can flip that script and it works just as well.
Well, let's look at like some of his, some of his finer moments was, just thanks to be a second Manassas.
Mm-hmm.
That Ammer and Hanville, that it was beautiful. The masterpiece at Chancellorsville.
But and then even Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville. Do we talk about day 2 where the rebels are able to outflank the 11 Corps, drive them back 2 miles? Or do we talk about day 3 where that same Corps runs headlong into the 12 Corps, especially Alpheus Williams' division, over and over and over again, taking extreme losses? Right. We tend to focus on day 2 of Chancellorsville. But even Chancellorsville, if we break down the events of the battle, is it because Lee audaciously outwits General why can't I think of his name right now? I really want to call General Hooker General Hancock for some reason. Is it because he outwits General Hooker? Or did he get lucky that Hooker was concussed, lost control of the situation, and then yielded control of Hazel Grove? And then by the time he retook control of the situation and ordered Sedgwick to advance, it was too late because Sedgwick was already withdrawn, right? Or maybe the whole reason he loses is because he ordered John Fulton Reynolds to take 1st Corps and to tie down the flank of 11 Corps. And by the time the orders arrived, 11 Corps was already flanked. And the whole reason for that is because they were experimenting with new telegraph systems, and the wire was extremely fragile and had been cut. What happens if 1st Corps is on the flank of 11 Corps, Jackson's Corps arrives, and they are facing front against an entire fortified federal position of 1st Corps?
Yeah, Chancellorsville was almost like everything had to fall exactly into place for that battle to be successful.
And I think that's the case with most things. Clausewitz puts it really well. I'm paraphrasing, but Clausewitz writes in the tiny amount of On War I've actually managed to get myself to read. Fascinating stuff, but it's not a page turner. He says that there is no. I'm paraphrasing. I'm going to try to use his language, but he says there's no activity in humanity which comes into such constant contact with providence than war. Luck is always the primary factor.
So going in, and won't talk too much about this, but because we have many discussions about it. But at Gettysburg, Lee's strength has always been to maneuver.
Yeah.
Why does he not maneuver in the face of the enemy? Road network?
Well, because he'd be doing what you just said. Maneuvering in the face of the enemy would be incredibly dangerous. If he was to redeploy his army after the Federals have established their line at Gettysburg, he's exposing his entire line of communication to the Federals while he's moving astride them. Because an army commander in the Civil War, they need to protect their own lines of communication while threatening the enemy's, right? If the enemy gets astride your line of communication, your line is turned. Lee is fighting in Pennsylvania. He's not fighting in Virginia. So if his line of communication is turned, he has no way to get back to Virginia. He has no way to reestablish that line of communication. He is in the enemy's country. He's in serious trouble.
He could be cut off at home.
Yeah. So I think, and I think what Longstreet supposedly suggested, and I'm not sure if that's really true, it's very much popularized by the film Gettysburg. That's an appalling idea, and I have trouble believing.
Yeah, I love when people say that. And I'm like, look at this road network. they would have been on one road. You're assuming Meade's not going to move off that hill. They would have been strung out their columns for miles down the road, and they would have ran into 4 corps. They would have been completely annihilated.
Unless Meade was generous enough to let them use some of the roads unobstructed. No, there's no way it could have worked. Once the battle began at Gettysburg, Lee had to fight or fall back.
And I've said that same thing, that once it started, he either had to fight his way out or he had to, fall back from that.
Yep.
Now, we talked about him on the offensive. Even at the Wilderness, he pulled off the 2 flank attacks, Gordon's flank attack and Hancock's. Longstreet's. And I believe Hancock said later, "You rolled us up like a wet blanket," or you could have rolled us up like a wet blanket. Two great moves. But then we see, like we talked about Antietam, and then at Spotsylvania, he goes purely defensive.
Yeah.
So he understood, and I guess it was the engineering in him. The way he built the intricate lines of interlocking cannon fire. I don't still understand why they was defending the Muleshoe salient, but he had some intricate defenses set up there.
My understanding for the Muleshoe, and I could be wrong, is because it was a key artillery platform. But unfortunately for Lee, he had begun to redeploy his artillery right before the attack, so he never got to take advantage of it. But I believe that's why he was defending what was otherwise, because generally speaking, you don't want to defend a salient. But my understanding is it was because it was such an excellent artillery platform, it was deemed to be worthy. But I could be wrong. I think what it comes down to, like, my understanding of the Overland Campaign is the wilderness is to steal a phrase from Shelby Foote, actually, because I love this phrase. It's just a hip thigh offensive, right? Like, you're not gonna. Generals only in the Civil War era, you only have a limited degree of tactical control if you're an army commander once battle is joined. But the wilderness, you're not going to have any, because you can barely see a damn thing. So all you can do, because the wilderness is so called because it is as thick as a wilderness, right? The flora is so thick, the foliage is so fair teamy, you can barely see a thing. And combine that with battle smoke, you're done. But I think that was sort of Lee's thinking, because if he were to attack Grant's army, or army group rather, which it effectively was at that point, what it would do. Oh, sorry, it's not a army with wilderness. That's later. Sorry.
It would negate his artillery strength and cavalry.
It mitigates everything, including his advantage in infantry, because no one can see what's going on. Right? It's supposed to be a shock and awe attack. And
that's a good analogy for that.
What baffles me about it, and how it would take someone better educated than I to answer this, is why he would adopt such a risk after Longstreet had explicitly warned him that Grant was going to be a very different opponent. I find it tends to get overlooked, but Grant and Longstreet were extremely close. Longstreet was Grant's best man at his wedding to Julia. And Longstreet obviously knew him very well. And he essentially told Lee, when he says, I'm paraphrasing, but Grant bites like the bulldog. When he sinks his teeth in, he's not going to let go. And for that reason, it baffles me that Lee would take that approach. My understanding is that was his plan, but it does make me wonder if maybe we tend to exaggerate somewhat his ability to read his opponent's mind. And that's not the only case where Lee fails to do so. In the Maryland campaign, Lee understandably believes that the Harpers Ferry garrison will withdraw once he turns their lines when he advanced into Maryland. And he did turn their lines of communication, but they didn't. Instead, they accepted a siege, which Lee considered to be a very regretful thing, because he didn't want to siege. Now, it would end up being the only time he actually bagged an army, but what he wanted was a straight offensive. And it caused the significant problems that almost resulted in the destruction of his army at first at South Mountain, then at Antietam, by dividing his forces. So, Lee didn't always predict everything with the divination of the Oracle of Delphi. He did get things wrong. By the time we get to Spotsylvania, Lee seems to have recognized that that audacity and the will to violence, to use that term, I just learned it recently, and it's a great term. That audacity and the will to violence wasn't going to win this time. That Grant was not going to be cowed by a almighty offensive, and he doesn't have the capital to expend on more attacks like this. He did have one other plan at the Oxford, which of course didn't pan out, where he actually might have been able to flank, I think, Hancock, but that never panned out. And that was bad luck. Lee was ill. Ewell didn't spring the attack. Who knows? You can never say it would have happened.
It said something about General Jackson would not allow those people to escape, or
Uh,
some, was that
I don't.
there, or was that at North Anna?
Sorry.
He said, I can't remember if it was there or if it was North Anna. He said something. General Jackson would have never allowed those people.
I could
Um,
definitely say something like that. I'm not familiar with the quote, but it's not hard to imagine. Supposedly Sandy Pendleton once said, "Oh, but for the spirit of Jackson." Fair enough. But regardless, I think by the time we get to Spotsylvania, Lee has realized that attrition warfare is his only option. And this is again a really great example of how we pigeonhole these generals into scripts. In the Grant the Butcher narrative, Grant's fighting a attrition war because he had done the cold calculus and he understands that the Confederates cannot resupply their men.
You know,
And
I
they're
don't understand why. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I hate how Grant gets criticized for being the
yeah,
butcher because he understands I've got numerically superior numbers. All I've got to do is keep coming at them, and I'm going to. They're eventually going to have no men left, and I
but
think
that's not what Grant was doing, and that's my point. That I don't agree with that at all. If you look at a campaign map of the Overland campaign, Grant is constantly trying to outflank Lee and force
trying to
him to fight
get around the right.
because he knows in an open battle Lee is unlikely to win. Now, this is where I tend to get annoyed with armchair generals. The response is, "Oh well, of course Lee isn't going to win. Lee is outnumbered 2-1. Grant couldn't beat him fair." That's not how war works. You're not supposed to have a fair fight. If you're having a fair fight, you made a
Lee
mistake.
won a lot of battles outnumbered.
Yeah,
You know, I
but that's
understand
not
what you're saying.
my point is that whole line of thinking is fundamentally flawed. If you are in a fair fight, you've made a mistake, right? And
Yeah.
Lee finding himself at Antietam, yeah, it's a great opportunity to flex, but finding yourself partially backed against the river with an enemy more than twice your size at your front, no, you've made a mistake here. So Grant's doing the smart thing. He's trying to force Lee into a battle that he can't win. The problem is Lee's army is operating in friendly territory on interior lines of communication and was always a
Short
more
supply lines.
army. And Grant has a confused command system because Grant's command system is now an army group. He has 2nd, 6th, and 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, but he also has the Independent 9 Corps under Burnside, and he has 23rd Corps, right? So he has 3 separate commands all trying to cooperate, and it's a mess. Eventually, he'll incorporate 9 Corps back in the Army of the Potomac, and that'll start to smooth things out, but it's really messy. Whereas Lee's command system is straightforward, it's at its peak efficiency with 3 Corps, runs into a big snafu with the loss of Longstreet, but other than that, it's a reliable command structure. So basically, what Grant was trying to do was the smart thing. It never would have worked. Now, maybe you criticize Grant for thinking it could have, or again, you take the opposite perspective and say, well, Grant was trying to do the smart thing. Lee is the one who's fighting an attrition war, not Grant. Lee is the one who decides if I fight on the defensive, I can bleed these people dry. And Lee, I think, is the one who's correct here because while on paper it might look like that Grant can bleed Lee dry, think about the logistics. As Grant advances, he has to detach troops to protect his lines of communication.
Right.
Meanwhile, as Lee withdraws, he withdraws into reinforcements. Whenever he withdraws, more local guard and militia can be added to his forces. More garrison troops can be added to his forces. Case in point, Lee will be reinforced to over 90,000 men after Cold Harbor. He'll have more men at Petersburg than he did at the start of the Overland campaign.
Lee had 90,000 men at Petersburg.
My understanding, yeah, that's the beginning, not the end.
Okay, no, I just never heard those numbers, because now I'm seeing more scholarship where, maybe the Confederates had a lot more numbers than what people have said. We talked about this, about Petersburg a few weeks ago. Hey, so let me ask you this right here.
That's my memory numbers, at least. If I got that wrong, apologies, but my recollection is about 90,000 at the beginning. By the end, it's a hell of a lot less.
Is it possible that, Lee's, when he made these battle plans and he gave them to his commanders, actually, he would not really have that much tactical control anymore, right? I mean, is he only as good as what his subordinates are?
Yeah. And only an unwise commander would try to control every aspect of a battle. McClellan was like that. McClellan tried to micromanage Antietam, And that's one of the reasons why at no point he had more than 46,000 men deployed, even though his army was nearly twice that in strength. So one of the reasons Lee is able to defend Antietam effectively is because even though McClellan had a huge numerical advantage and he still had the advantage of many of those men being fresh, but nevertheless, he never actually had a numerical advantage on the field at any given time, except where Confederate force was exhausted. Well, I should rephrase that. He could still have a numerical advantage unit to unit, but in terms of overall number deployed in each army, he doesn't have a huge numerical advantage because he deploys them so inefficiently. So he doesn't deploy them a sufficient number at the same time. He's deploying small numbers piecemeal so we can control them. Lee is smarter than that. Lee would say to, I can't remember his name, his full name. I believe his last name was Ross. He was Prussian, despite the name sounding sounding extremely British. He would say to Ross, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, my duty as an army commander is to bring my army to a point of contact where they can have as great advantage as possible over the enemy and do as much damage to the enemy to gain as much as possible for the cause. After the battle is joined, it is in the hands of my corps commanders and God. So Lee's going to give you the broad overview. So, okay, I want my on echelon attack. But after making those orders, he's waiting, he's getting information. Unless he's getting a request to release additional reinforcements or to, move, forces from one corps to another. Otherwise, he's not going to do anything.
Because so it reminds me of I don't know how much you keep up with in Canada, but like I'm sure you've heard of Nick Saban, Alabama football coach. So it's kind of like he's putting in the game plan, and then his coordinators or Lee's corps commanders, they're the ones that's going to be responsible for executing the battle plan. So it's possible to say that maybe Lee could have been one of the best planners, but we know that it goes out after the first shot.
I think what Lee was good at was maneuvering his army into a position where they could do damage. So take the Battle of Second Manassas, right? Second Manassas is this ballet where Lee is entertaining McClellan. It's easy to forget, but McClellan's Grand Army of the Potomac is still there. They haven't left. They've been driven into the Urbana, but they haven't left, and they're still threatening Richmond. And he's keeping a sufficient force to keep them entertained and to allay the concerns of President Davis, while also increasingly deploying forces against the miscreant Pope. And he's doing this by giving Jackson a route to harass General Pope, culminating in Battle of Second Manassas, while eventually consolidating enough forces under Longstreet's wing. These aren't corps, by the way. They are corps, but they're unofficial corps. They're called wings at this point because there is no corps system yet legally in the Confederacy. But then consolidating enough forces under Longstreet to march by a separate route to strike the flank. That's all maneuver warfare, and it's really incredible maneuver warfare, all while keeping McClellan at bay.
Have we seen this type of maneuver warfare prior on this level?
Yeah. It would make Napoleon very happy.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I had a total mind blank right there. I wasn't even thinking about the Napoleonic Wars. I've just been reading about some of the battles today. Yeah, totally botched that one. I forgot the question I was fixing to ask you about Lee.
Just to give you some time for a second to cover for you. I mean, it's what we're seeing in the 19th century is with the expansion of industrialized agriculture and transportation, we're seeing population explosions, and we're seeing larger armies. Nations can support larger armies, mobilize larger armies. So that's why you have corps invented in the Napoleonic era, because you need corps to organize forces of this magnitude. I mean, you have armies that they haven't been this large since antiquity. So it's fairly new in history, but the Napoleonic Wars certainly exceed the scale of the Civil War. And what's remarkable about the Civil War is its scale for a singular country. But, all of this is building to its apotheosis, which in the end is mobilizing 3 million men to invade Russia in June of 1941, which is like the high watermark of just incalculably massive military operations.
So let me ask you this question. I hear, people that criticize Lee as being aggressive and attacking casualties. Did he have any other option? Because I mean, you couldn't enact a Fabian strategy where you're giving up Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Um, you had to have a power of government. I don't think he had any choice but to
Well,
be the aggressor.
no, I think it's a good observation. Davis and Lee at War is a book I've been slowly reading for like 3 years now. I pick it up, read a bit, put it down. I never focus, so I always have to admit how slow I am on these things. But Davis and Lee at War is, among other things, about this question. Donald Stoker also explores this in The Grand Design. So to crib from those sources, excuse me, there's sort of two broad strategies that the Confederacy can adopt. It could adopt a, as you said, Fabian strategy. I think is the perfect word for it, where you are exchanging space for time, slowing the federal advance, bleeding the federal advance, and where possible, consolidating and counterattacking federal lines of communications in order to harass their advances and to delay them until European intervention arrives, or until the federal war machine simply runs out of support at home. One of America's biggest strategic weaknesses in this war is that it's a democracy, and Lincoln is not going to change that fact. So there is a lot to say for that strategy. Now, it depends on who's doing it, and a bit of nuance that I think. I was having a discussion with someone on Twitter, actually. He runs I'm not going to say the name of the account because it's not an account I'd recommend. He has no idea what he's talking about, but he likes to spread a lot of very elementary level Civil War mythology, and he's very uneducated in the subject. His confidence is matched only by his ignorance on the subject. But he was lecturing me on how Davis and Lee had totally opposite views on Davis and Johnson had totally opposite views in the war, and that's not true at all. Davis and Johnson both fundamentally believe in the same thing: fall back, coordinate, consolidate, counterattack. Johnson just didn't really ever do the last part. He was really better at just falling back. To steal a phrase from James McPherson, it's pithy, but I quite like it. Had General Johnson had his way, the decisive battle of the Civil War would have been fought in Key West, Florida. Davis, though, he did have a similar strategy. Davis didn't like taking big risks. Davis liked a reactionary defensive system, which is similar to Johnson. Let's see what the Federals are going to do, and then we will hit them where we can. At the beginning of the war,
he was the aggressor.
And the cordon defense strategy is defend all the territory you can. Davis quickly realizes that doesn't work, but we have to remember there's always a political dimension here. And the political dimension is every one of his member states is demanding their territory be protected and have a very parochial view of the war, or rather myopic one, I should say, where they haven't given any consideration to the needs of the other states, right? And to the fact that if the Federal Army chooses to attack their 1,000-man garrison, it'll go as well as any other 1,000-man garrison fighting the Federal Army. So by mid-62, Davis has realized the only way to really, or early 62, the only way to really win this war is to concentrate our forces and to be willing to sacrifice swaths of land in the West for now and retake it. And this might sound like a bad idea, but tell me how that's really different from Washington at the Revolution, right? Washington is going to lose New York. He's going to lose Philadelphia. Huge portions of American territory. They never get Boston back, occupied by the British during the American Revolution. But the Fabian strategy works, delaying and harassing the British, winning the occasional victory until the French give them aid in 1779. And by 1781, they're wrapping it all up in a nice bow. So there's a lot to be said for that strategy. And part of that was Davis's belief that Europe would intervene. Lee doesn't seem to believe Europe would intervene. In the Maryland campaign, he never writes anything which would suggest he thinks Europe is going to help. His proposal to Davis is nothing about Europe. His correspondence is nothing about Europe. His belief seems to have been essentially, we must win signal victories now to destabilize the federal initiative, prevent them from consolidating the mass of their force, because if they concentrate their mass at any one of our points, we can't stop them. They're too huge.
He understood, like Yamamoto did in World War II, about the industrial might of the United States.
Just about who?
He understood fast forward that what Yamamoto understood about the industrial might of the United States, once they got that machine rolling, there was going to be no way to stop them.
Yeah. I'd say that's a fair analogy. Although I would say the difference, of course, is with Yamamoto, he understood that the war against America was suicide from the start, barring a miracle at Pearl Harbor, whereas the Confederates, I think, had a real chance of victory. The gulf is much greater. But yeah, the same basic fear. Once they get going, it's going to be hard to stop them. So Lee's hope is to end the war early, before the federal war machine could be fully mobilized, and to prevent the Federals from taking advantage of the initiative and therefore leveraging their advantages against the Confederacy.
So we have Bull Run.
He might have also been concerned that the Confederate alliance was fragile, and what would be required to keep that Confederate alliance functioning was victories to inspire its people. The Confederate nationalism is not something that seems to really have existed. He had to give them some reason to believe in their new country beyond simply fear of abolitionism, which was really the only driving cultural force behind accepting the Confederate government, was fear of a world where slavery was abolished and racial anarchy. So both of them have political reason for their strategy. Davis doesn't want to risk the destruction of the Confederate armies because that means he would lose the confidence of the Confederate member states, and the Confederacy wouldn't have the logistics to resupply them. Lee is concerned for the same issues of unity and logistics, but his conclusion is we need to win the war early, and we need to stop the Federals from leveraging their primary advantages. So they both want to attack or react for the same reasons, but they come to very different strategic conclusions. So when you ask the question,
that brings me my question for you. We have Bull Run. First one. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. My apologies.
I always take a long time, but it was circling back. So
I love your analogies.
So to answer your question, as I've done so in the longest way possible, Lee, you asked if he could have done anything other than attack. He could have a reactionary defense, but realistically, at the end of the day, what they were choosing between was ensuring immediate Confederate survival, but at a probably ultimately losing the war, and that's Davis's reactionary defense, because unless Europe intervenes, they will slowly be whittled away, or unless the federal home effort runs out of steam, which is unlikely without signal victories. Or you take Lee's approach, which is a fast action gambling, audacious approach, which looks to destroy home front morale through signal victories and looks to destroy the federal war effort through signal victories.
That's what fit his personality.
And it really comes down to, do you want to do a fast action gamble, decide the outcome of the war right now? Or do you want to guarantee our short-term survival at the risk of inevitable defeat? My favorite summation of this, Woodworth uses this in the book that I'm someday will finish. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read Lee and Davis at War, do read it faster than me too, for God's sake. But Lee will write to Davis when proposing the Antietam campaign. I'm not going to get it quite right, but basically the quote is, while this campaign may result in the destruction of our army, I do not believe that victory is impossible.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's Lee's version of, and that's why it's a good idea. So, Jeff, I'm just going to go for it. If you don't like it, you'll let me know. Yeah? Okay. We're crossing the Potomac. And your reaction was Davis's reaction of, oh, good. You're saying that might not be impossible for us to win in this all-out gamble you want to take. Great.
Okay, so the question, first Manassas. Mm-hmm. Confederate victory. Mm-hmm. Why not?
Battlefield of Lee's choosing, by the way.
Why not march on Washington or try to take the fight and end it then, instead of waiting a year and letting the Federals start to build their armies?
Oh, that's what Davis wanted to do. And I've read different theories. I
read that Jackson wanted to push Jackson tried to push the first day when they were on the run.
Yes, one of the very few times he and Davis saw eye to eye. Also the first time they met, and the only time they met somewhat well, although right from the beginning, Davis thought Jackson was a bit insane. The two really did not like each other at all.
Yeah, most people didn't like Jackson.
Yeah, so to the point that Davis basically gave Lee an out to not promote Jackson to Corps command. When he creates the corps, he says, he reminds him, you may, of course, choose any generals you see fit. Wink, wink, it doesn't have to be Jackson. And when Lee responds, Longstreet and Jackson are his choices, he simply states Longstreet. But when he talks about Jackson, he goes into detail about how good of a general Jackson is, because he has to justify to Davis, hear me out, I'm sticking with Jack. But anyway, it's a non sequitur. So why don't they drive in? Disorganization. The rebel army was more disorganized in victory than the Federals were in defeat. Davis wanted to do so. Beauregard and Johnston talked him out of it, basically saying, we're not organized. The Federals will have a defensive reserve that we may not be able to overcome. If we take the risk, we may lose everything that we have accomplished in this victory. So Davis errs on the side of caution. But it's interesting. It's one of the rare moments where Davis is the one who's urging a not just limited counterattack, which he often would, but an outright offensive.
Yeah.
Davis often urges his commanders to counterattack and take the risk of a battle. This is where he's different from Johnson. He rarely urges an outright invasion or an all-out offensive campaign. It's usually a reactive counterattack, like Chickamauga or Peachtree Creek at Atlanta. But this was a case where it's Davis, of all people, saying we should go for it. And of all people, it's Beauregard who's saying that's a little ambitious. So the roles kind of get reversed.
Yeah, I think it's, because you kind of call it, we just won this huge victory, and you don't know what to do. Do we pursue this or
Yeah.
So I can see where they were caught off. I mean, had Lee been in command, I mean, would he have pursued?
If Lee had been in command, would they have won the battle? McDowell loses the battle because his plan is too complicated. And we were just talking about that being a problem for Lee. I often like to wonder, people ask, what if Lee had accepted the command of Army Northeastern Virginia? Maybe he becomes a minor hero in American history, suppressing this rebellion early on and in doing so also preserving slavery, which would certainly have survived such a short Civil War. At least in the short term. It would have ultimately ended in the long term either way.
This question, when do you think it would have ended?
Oh, well, Secretary Seward figured it would take 50 years with the restriction of slavery. Lincoln figured
well into the 1900s.
So pessimistically, maybe 1960, instead of the Civil Rights Act, you have a gradual end to American slavery, which is incredibly shameful, frankly. So, frankly, I'm happy the Confederates won the first battle of Manassas, and I'm happy they won the Peninsula campaign as well, because they were some of the
Lincoln's quote? It's bad, it's damn bad.
Sorry?
What was Lincoln's quote after First Manassas? It's bad, it's damn bad.
Yeah, I think Winfield Scott told him it's bad, and he responded, "It's damned bad."
So I guess I got final question here for you with this. Lee, obviously, he's not the marble man that so many of, I'm supposed to call it, neo-Confederates make him out to be. He's also not the horrible general that so many Lee haters make him out to be. Where does he?
It's a bit reductionist. Well, it's become the popular thing. It's the new edgy thing to say. Oh, right. I you know what? I'll be honest. Even though my political affiliations are very proudly left wing, I don't like reactionary thinking from the left wing any more than the right wing. I think both are anti-intellectual.
And that's what I appreciate about you.
I'm not a big fan of the Nazis, but I wouldn't want to go against Urban Rommel. Anyway, you were saying the question about
yeah. So I mean, in all fairness to him, and there's a lot of people to compare to. I mean, where does he rank in American generals? Does he rank at the top? I'm not saying the top, but in the top echelon, middle group, or the lower rung. I mean, I would think he would be considered in the top generals that we've had.
I think in terms of his ability at maneuver warfare, he's in that. He's in the top rung, if you want to call it that, I suppose. In terms of his capacity to inspire his men, he certainly hits that sweet spot of that a few other generals also meet. McClellan, ironically, meets him in that respect. I can't say of all generals because I haven't studied other eras to the degree I've studied the Civil War. feel as confident talking about them. I have a working knowledge, but not something that I would consider to be impressive. But I would say I'm going to appeal to the tier system that John Keegan uses in his military history of the Civil War. And he proposes 5 tiers of generals. And in the 5-tier system, Lee is an excellent example of a tier 2 general. So your 5th tier of generals are generals who are so actively terrible that their presence is a problem for the forces they portend to support. So General Roger Pryor, who started the war as a major general and ended the war as a private in the Confederate forces, a tier 5 general. He's a major reason why the Sunken Road was not reinforced during the Battle of Antietam. I would personally say General Polk would be a good contender for a tier 5 general. He's one of the reasons Kentucky will fight on the side of the Union, and he'll spend the rest of the war desperately searching for a new bad idea to fall in love with after another, until eventually, to the misfortune of the Union, he's cut down by a federal shell at Pine Ridge. Then you have your tier 4 generals. And your tier 4 generals are generals who are, kind of bad. They're not catastrophic, but they're not great. So, I don't know, maybe General Cheatham. General Bragg, I'd probably put in the 4th tier. Very good.
I'm not as hard on Bragg as some people are.
Yeah, I feel a bit of sympathy for Bragg, but not great. Burnside would be a tier 4 general. I understand why some people put him in tier 5, but while Fredericksburg is a irredeemable F up, and he bears a significant amount of responsibility.
But his plan was sound.
Yes, it was exactly. But
it also
failed. But what I would say about Burnside is, before you render your judgment, look at the North Carolina campaign,
the Knoxville campaign,
Tennessee. The man could get things done. So I put him in tier 4, just throwing it out there. Then you get your tier 3s. Your tier 3s are generals who are very good. They're reliable, they're competent, they're solid. These are hard to find. Like most people are going to be tier 4 or tier 5. Longstreet, to me, is one of the best examples of a tier 3. Reliable, competent, sound, maybe not so great independently, as he demonstrated in Tennessee, and maybe not so great when under a lackluster Army commander, as he also demonstrated in Tennessee, but otherwise reliable and sound. He'd probably call himself a tier 1. I'd say tier 3. Another example of a tier 3 might be Hooker, right? Who generally speaking was reliable and could even be innovative. Chancellorsville, he has a lot of innovative ideas, still gets whipped. Then you got your tier 2s, and your tier 2s are generals who are superb. These are very rare brilliance. These are men who, under the right conditions, can do incredible things, and can exercise masterful command of their forces. So some of your tier 2s, Philip Sheridan, George Pat Thomas, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, some of the best generals of the war are your tier 2s. Then you get your tier 1s, and your tier 1s, to be a tier 1, this is an exceptional rarity. These are people who not only are able to command in brilliant style, they're not only incredible maneuver warfare, they're not only demonstrating phenomenal capacity for adapt, improvise, and overcome, all that lovely stuff. Well, actually, adapt, improvise, overcome actually is what typifies them, I should say. But what makes them brilliant is their ability to rethink doctrine and to abandon it and reinvent it. Lee doesn't often get too far past doctrinal thinking. I know some people say he defies elements of Jomini, but I don't know. That's presupposing anyone's following Jomini in the Civil War. But Lee's movements are generally rather doctrinal, maintaining your line of supply, turning your enemy's line of supply, yada, yada. But then you get people like General Grant or General Sherman, and they're your tier 1. And these are folks who could see the entire war in its complexity and could think strategically and creatively about how to solve problems. Grant defies basic doctrine at Vicksburg in the most brilliant way in order to maintain an effective operation in the enemy's rear and to besiege the enemy in their rear. That's freaking crazy.
It was beautiful.
Doing so between 2 active armies. General Sherman throws the entire manual out the window in his Georgia and Carolinas campaign, where he says This march will be an act of statesmanship, not of war. We will demonstrate to the Confederacy and to the world that the government cannot protect its citizens, right? Like it's brilliant, the logistical war of Sherman's march. Those are tier one, because not only are they winning, but they're doing so by changing and creating doctrine, which can then be adapted to the future. And Grant and Sherman are going to impact the 20th century in a way that Lee, frankly, does not, because Lee is fighting. Lee is an incredible Napoleonic soldier. Grant and Sherman are some of your first modern commanders. And that's why they.
Good analysis. Okay, so I got one last question for you. And maybe some of this is myth and legend, but we know that Billy's Bummers, they love Sherman. But why is it that seems like there was such a stronger connection between Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia troops? Because I've found 4 or 5 incidences now of Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear. You have an idea what made that bond seem so tight between them?
I think because Lee comes to them very early in the war and he starts bringing them dramatic victories. And not to mention, Lee himself was affable. He was incredibly handsome. He was inspiring. He seemed to be damn near perfect. He was. Now,
he was built. I mean,
I don't believe in the marble man thing, but I will say in the context of the 1860s, Lee is a pretty stalwart Southern gentleman. I think all that is a factor, but I think the most important factor is he brings them victory, and stylishly. Now, Grant will do the same, but Grant's victories are hard won. Well, I don't like the attrition narrative of the Overland Campaign. His soldiers were fighting in the course of 3 months. They were fighting. They lost 60% of the entire accumulated losses of the past 3 years. Like there's really no way to overstate the hyper violence of the Overland Campaign. Yeah, we're driving them, but this is awful, right? It's hell. It was hell. Like some accounts say that the men looked like different people by the end of those 3 months, right? And unlike the Army of Northern Virginia, which technically had 3 commanders, but if you ask them, they'd only say 2, because Gustavus W. Smith commanded them such a brief time. Most of them would not have even known Smith was ever their commander. It's a bit of borrowing trivia for you, by the way. Gustavus W. Smith is the commander, very briefly, of the then Army of the Potomac, renamed Northern Virginia. But whereas the Potomac, they had, well, let's go down the list. Some of them, at least, had McDowell, the enlistees of April '61. The original 3 monthers turned 3 years. Then they had McClellan. Then a lot of them had Pope. Then they had McClellan again, those who hadn't lost McClellan the first time. Then they get Burnside. Then they get Hooker. And then they get Meade. And apparently without losing Meade, now they've got Grant. So at this point, the relationship is, okay, Ulysses, what can you do? They didn't.
And I actually think the Wilderness was the turning point.
Well, the Wilderness, I think, is where he shows that he's a different kind of commander. And there's, of course, the famous story of, we're heading south and the men cheer. But what's interesting is Grant never gets a nickname from the Potomac Army. Grant had nicknames throughout the North, Unconditional Surrender Grant, Uncle Sam Grant. They're great. The American Sphinx, I think, is his nickname after the war. But he doesn't really get one like Mars Robert or Uncle Billy or Little Mac. Because the Army never seems to have, at least the Army of the Potomac, have loved him. More so, It was a respectful relationship. We trust you. You know what you're doing. Let's get this done. Which I think also reflects Grant's view as well. And I think part of it might have also, and I'm just speculating here, I think part of it's also the fact that Grant didn't really enjoy this either, right? Lee enjoyed war.
It's war. We should grow too fond of this. I'm so glad that the one part that they caught in Gettysburg when Lee was riding, but Martin Sheen was riding back on his horse, and they almost cut filming, and Maxwell said, "No, keep recording." And the soldiers coming out and started chanting his name, and you could see the look on Martin Sheen's face of just sheer shock. Yeah. And he never broke character. Yeah. And at that moment, he became Robert E. Lee, and they became the Army of Northern Virginia, and they became one.
And I think it also shows just the legacy of Lee. And also, we need to check that as well, because that also impacts how we remember Lee as being universally loved. No commander's universally loved.
I was sad, I hated him.
If you look through contemporary accounts, you're going to find Confederate soldiers saying Lee doesn't know what he's doing, especially early war. But you'll find it throughout the.
Granny Lee.
Yep. Hell, one of the most popular Confederate memoirs, Company Hatch or Big Soda to the Sideshow. That's Sam Watkins' memoir. He goes out of his way on numerous occasions to defend General Bragg. He liked Bragg, which totally flies in the face of the Mr. Here's Your Mule narrative, where the entire army hated him upside down, left, right, and wanted to shoot him in the back. So, it's important not to get trapped in these narratives. And what's cool about that shot in Gettysburg is it really shows us, at least in 1993, how these reenactors, and if anyone's engaged with the mythology of the war and the narrative and the romance of the war, it is reenactors. I say that as someone who used to reenact. Still got some Union uniforms over in the closet.
Yeah, you did 1812, right?
Yeah, and the Civil War.
Okay.
Civil War. But my point is, it reflects the power of that narrative, and we have to be careful when we look, when we speculate on the past and how characters in the past felt about these individuals. We have to be careful not to project our own present interpretation.
I guess my favorite story is the first one that happened is when Longstreet's Corps arrived just in time at the Wilderness, and the Texas Brigade was there, and Lee said something, I knew you would not let me down, and they noticed Lee had taken the, he was leading the charge, and that's when, the NCOs grabbed the reins of the horse and going to the lead of the rear. And Melvin loaded a post today. I love Melvin. He's a great post. But he was asking, which character did the best in Gettysburg, and I said to go, hands down, Martin Sheen nailed that character. I mean, I think, a lot of the other ones did great jobs, but from everything from the stare that Lee would give to the temper that would come out on occasion, I just think Sheen nailed it.
He's excellent. I would say, and it's apropos you're bringing this up because this weekend is the 30th anniversary of the release of the film. But in my opinion, the best performances in that film are Jeff Daniels and Richard Jordan. I got to give it to those two. I think they give it.
I can't argue with that. My thing was more nailing a character, how they were, but the best performances, I agree with you on those. And I got to give a shout out to Sam Elliott too.
Although Sam Elliott's portrayal of Buford is totally historically inaccurate. He's nothing like the real Buford. The real Buford was very soft spoken. He was actually quite sweet, very good fighter, but much more affable and calm. Sam Elliott's up there basically saying, I'm Sam Elliott, and today I'm General Sam Elliott. Because he's one of those actors who can do that. It's kind of like Sean Connery in Red October, where you're not seeing a Russian commandant, you're seeing what would have happened if Sean Connery had defected to the Soviet Union and became a commandant. Hence leading to him saying, and after a fantastic Russian sentence stated by Alec Baldwin, you have the response with the thick Scottish accent. You Paul Rusky?
We got to watch this movie one night and comment on it, because I was thinking about watching a movie today where General Heath comes up and General Lee, the situation is very confused. He goes, what has happened? Well, I moved in as I ordered, and just some dismounted militia, and I didn't think we all held back, and it was dismounted cavalry. Well, they really put up a good scrap. Well, they wouldn't leave. My boys got the dander up. We deployed the whole division, almost had them running. We got pushed back. Things will get out of control, Mr. Heath. That is why we have orders.
Yeah, he nails Lee's. Frankly, Lee was very passive aggressive. But Lee, there was a sweetness to Lee too, where he was very reluctant to hurt anyone's feelings. So whenever he wanted to get rid of a general, he would recommend that perhaps they could be an even greater service elsewhere. So when he was getting rid of the utterly incompetent William W. Loring, who had an incredible gift for bringing disaster wherever he went, all the way through to the end of the war. When he recommends to Davis that he be transferred, Davis begins to transfer, and then finishing his very gentlemanly, no hard feelings approach, Lee writes and says, "We will, of course, regret to lose the services of General Loring." And then Davis responds, "Well, General Lee, I still have him in Richmond. I can return him if you'd like." To which Lee hastily responds, "No, that's fine."
Lee did not like confrontation.
No, he didn't. He didn't like, and this is a point really against him. He didn't like confrontation, but he didn't. He didn't have a problem with abusing his aides. Which, I mean, you could argue perhaps reflects the deeply stratified aristocratic old Europe kind of mentality of the southern states, right? But when he, and I not like he was like horrible to them constantly or anything, no, but when he was angry, he really could displace that anger.
And they said he had a volatile temper that he just kept suppressed. And
he would at times just be completely unfair. One time
he dismantled Stewart.
I think he once yelled at Brigadier General, "How am I supposed to achieve success when you young people will not follow my orders? I'm just a Brigadier General, dude. But I did what you asked."
And General Gordon came and reported to him, "We've driven the army north above the river," and screamed, "No, go damage them all you can." When it was a moment when he lost his temper.
So he was, I don't know. I mean, Lee's.
But he had another unique gift too, man. He held together a lot of different personalities.
Yeah, and any good leader has to. You have to be able to balance frustrating people. Grant did the same thing. General Bragg was someone who was not very good at that, which is one of the reasons he was a failure in the West. Now, in fairness, General Bragg had to deal with the volatile personalities that Lee had essentially jettisoned from Virginia. I mean, D.H. Hill being the perfect example. Because the Confederate West was, I think this was also, I think Woodworth actually in the Sixth Armies of Tennessee said this. It's a great quote, whoever said it. That it might have been McPherson, but the Confederate Western Department was the land of second opportunities for failed Confederate generals. So there you have even more volatile personalities, and you have a leader who is incapable of harmonizing them. And that's also arguably, I would say, one of the reasons why the West only really functions when you have Johnston or Beauregard in command, because those guys actually could, especially Johnston. He could harmonize people. Johnston was incredibly. Johnston was a lot like Bernard Montgomery. Lovely to serve under, not particularly fun to command. So he was someone who could do that. But Bragg, no, Bragg's the opposite. Bragg is lovely to command, appalling to have as a commander, because he was just a deeply cantankerous, argumentative, and inimical individual.
So I got one more question for you, and then we kept filming. I want to ask you something, but all right, Battle of the Wilderness.
Okay.
Grant, or we'll just say Meade's still in command.
Well,
Meade does like, well, I mean, technically was, but Meade does like every other commander does: retreats above the river, refits, reorganizes. Does Lee roll the dice and take one more chance and maneuver and invade the north?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think, and I could be wrong with this, I think in 64 at one point Davis floats the idea, but I don't know if this is true. And Lee responds, "I don't think we're capable of doing so. Maybe we never really were." But again, I'm not sure if that's the case, because that's not really Davis's style. So don't quote me on that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel like I have no idea, man.
I'm thinking the gambler he was, that he may realize this is my last chance.
Yeah, but that might have passed at Gettysburg, to be honest. I think absolutely he would move his headquarters closer to Meade. Like he would shift the theater of operations and advance them. I don't. Well, let me put it this way: in your scenario, where does Meade retreat to? Because the Wilderness, he's fairly into Virginia. How far is he falling back here?
I don't know. I would just have to look at the maps and see.
I can't imagine him falling back beyond Fredericksburg, because Fredericksburg would have been the base of operations. Oh, sorry, I skipped a message. Okay. I mean, presumably, if General Meade was generous enough to retreat all the way back across the Potomac, then I could see Lee following it up. I think what's more likely is he would have wanted to take the offensive, and maybe what would have been in his mind is, can we retake Fredericksburg, which would have been a disaster for the Federals. I could see that happening. Wait, I just said retreat to Fredericksburg. Sorry, it's really late and I'm really tired, and that was really dumb.
That's all right.
Fredericksburg. I don't know why I was so stupid to say that. Oh my god, I
No,
way.
I messed up. I said that totally earlier, so that couldn't have been more done than my comment.
Yeah, it's been a
Uh,
long.
we'll get,
So yeah, I guess if he wins at the Wilderness, I don't know. He probably could. Well, he could still consolidate at Fredericksburg. That'd be a bold decision, but a smart one, especially if he's on the north side of Stafford's Heights. He could easily defend it, and he still has the road network. And that would be a very difficult thing for Lee to take. I could almost imagine at that point Lee huddling down for the defensive, at least temporarily. Lee would have wanted to take the offensive, but then your problem is similar to the situation in following the Battle of Fredericksburg. Okay, the enemy's initiative has been halted, but I can't get across the Rappahannock and over to Stafford's Heights without having my army torn to shreds. And of course, that's ultimately solved by Hooker being driven back in Chancellorsville and then retreating towards Pennsylvania. So it really would depend on your scenario. How far does Meade fall back? If Meade falls back towards Pennsylvania and Maryland, then and Lee can again screen his movements behind the mountains, he might try it one more time. I'm sure he'd want to. But at the same time, he's failed twice. The other question, I think this is the more important question, would Davis let him? And I don't think Davis would be very excited about the plan. Still can't believe I managed to forget that the Wilderness is right beside Fredericksburg. They're literally the same national park. It's 11:30. My brain's shutting down. I think that's probably a
yes,
sign. I can make a
thanks.
mistake.
Thanks always, man. It's a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to many more to come.
Catch you later.
Let's start recording.